Welcome. Tonight we follow the shadowed path of Ares, from Olympus to the fields of war, through rage, loss, and silence. This is what the god of war was truly up to across the myths. If this journey settles your mind, whisper back by liking or subscribing. It helps the stories keep flowing. Now let the myths begin, and let your thoughts grow quiet. After the great king of the gods took Hera as his wife, their union became one of both power and consequence among the immortals. She lay beside him, the father of gods and mortals, and from their divine bond came children who would take their place in the stories of the heavens and earth. From Hera and Zeus were born Hebe, the youthful goddess of eternal beauty and the cupbearer of the gods, Aloadae, the gentle bringer of childbirth who watched over women in labor, and Ares, the fierce god of war. Among these three, it was Ares who carried a nature most unlike his sisters. Though born of Zeus and Hera, Ares was not calm or patient like his mother, nor wise like his father. His spirit was fiery and restless, wild and violent. Even the goddess of justice once spoke of him as proof of her words. Ares, raised by Hera, was shaped into a god who knew no restraint, no care for the laws or customs of others. He was a force of chaos and blood, his heart always racing towards battle, his joy found in war's cruel laughter. He wandered the roads and fields, letting his anger flare, shooting down travelers with deadly arrows and striking his enemies with hooked spears. He did not hesitate or hold back, and in his bloodlust he felt a grim satisfaction. The scent of death pleased him, and he laughed in the face of destruction. This violent nature stood in contrast to the more peaceful and gracious beings born of the same union, for Ares was a god made for war alone. Ancient poets like Olin sang of Hera and named only Ares and Hebe as her children, perhaps focusing on the strength and beauty that came from her womb. And though Aloadae was often remembered as well, it was Ares who left the deepest mark on the world. In the land of Sparta, a road led across the river and past a place where an ancient sanctuary stood, built in honor of Ares. Here he was not called by his usual name, but was known as Theritas, the beastly one. This name came from a tale that said his nurse had been a woman called Thero, and though the Greeks did not remember such a nurse clearly, they believed the name might have come from distant people in the east. It was a fitting title for a god whose heart was full of wildness. In another tradition told by the Romans, it was said that Juno and Jupiter had brought forth Mars, as they called Ares and Zeus, and in this way the same story echoed through time, with new names, but the same fierce meaning. Though the text gave only a few lines to describe his birth and nature, those lines painted a picture of a god like no other, born from two mighty rulers, but made in fire and blood. From the embrace of Zeus and Hera came not only grace and life, but also fury and destruction. In their children, one could see all the colors of the divine, youth and beauty in Hebe, the pain and miracle of childbirth in Aloadae, and the harsh, unyielding strength of battle in Ares. Their story, told in fragments by poets, historians, and travelers, revealed the deep and ancient belief that from love and power could rise both harmony and havoc. Ares was never a quiet god, never one to fade into the background. His path was carved in iron and echoing with the clash of weapons. His mother had reared him, but even she may not have foreseen the storm that would grow within him. In every mention, Ares appeared as a reminder that the children of the gods carried both gifts and dangers, and that even the highest union could bring forth a child who thrived in war. There was once a time when Hera felt a deep sorrow in her heart, not from loss, but from pride wounded by the axe of her husband. For when Athena sprang fully grown from the head of Zeus, formed without the touch of a woman, Hera watched in silent pain. It was not only the birth that troubled her, but the idea that Zeus had claimed the title of both father and mother in one, a creator without a partner. She could not bear the thought that he had achieved this alone, while she, the queen of the gods, was left aside. So with a heart full of unrest, she journeyed to the edge of the world to speak with Oceanus, the ancient river that encircles the earth. But before she reached her destination, she stopped to rest at the house of Flora, the goddess of blooming flowers and secret growth. Flora saw her at the doorstep, weary from travel, and asked what had brought her so far. Hera, still burning with her thoughts, shared her purpose. She told of her pain and her desire to bear a child on her own, untouched by any man, to prove that she too could do what Zeus had done. She spoke of the drugs she would search for across the wide earth, in the oceans, and even in the shadows of the underworld, anything that could grant her a mother's power without a father's presence. As she spoke, Flora listened in silence, her heart caught between the desire to help and the fear of the mighty thunderer's wrath. 3 times she tried to answer, and 3 times fear stole her voice. But Hera, desperate and determined, swore on the river Styx that her name would never be revealed. Assured of secrecy, Flora shared her secret. In her sacred garden near Olenus, there was a flower like no other. It held within it a strange power, one said to make even the barren fertile. She had once tested its strength by touching it to a cow that had never known birth, and in an instant the creature had become a mother. Without delay, Flora plucked that same flower with her own hand and offered it to Hera. The queen of the gods felt the power of the flower, and with only a single touch, she conceived. She did not return home, but wandered far, hiding her mystery within her, crossing into the cold lands of Thrace and along the shores of the western sea. In the solitude of that distant place, she brought forth a child, a son born not from union, but from divine will alone. This child was Ares, fierce and full of storm, brought into existence by Hera through the magic of a flower, through longing and pride. And though he was not shaped by the fire of his father, he burned with his own flame. In time, Ares grew, and his first moments on earth were not in palaces or temples, but in the open fields. In the soft grasses of spring, among the tender blades that bent beneath his small hands, the newborn god crawled upon the bosom of the earth. He did not cry out for milk, nor did he rest quietly, but instead he pushed forward with his tiny body, crushing the flowers beneath him. The snow of Thrace still lay upon the hills, and the winds were cold, yet the young god knew no fear. He called not with tears, but with a voice full of strength, longing not for comfort, but for the warmth of the one who nursed him. Even in his earliest days he showed signs of what he would become. That wild, snowy land, Thrace, seemed to call to him like a home, wrapping him in its silence and storm. It was in these lands, far from Olympus, that the god of war first opened his eyes and met the world not with peace, but with the fire of a child born of determination and magic. Years later, as Ares grew into his full power and took his place among the gods, he never forgot who had helped bring him into being. Though he had no father in the act of creation, he remembered Flora and her gift. And in the time of Romulus, long after gods had taken their places in the stories of mortals, Ares spoke with honor of the goddess who had helped give him life. He said that she, too, should be remembered in the city that bore his name and legacy. The tale of Ares' birth was hidden from most, kept in shadows, and told only in whispers. Yet in the quiet folds of poetry, the truth remained. Hera had created life without a man. A flower had carried divine power. A child had crawled through snow and grass to begin a life that would one day bring fear to armies and strength to war. Behind the violent image of the god of battle was a softer, stranger beginning, one rooted not in blood or thunder, but in quiet jealousy, in a flower's touch, and in the cold winds of Thrace. In the long wars that shaped the heavens, there was a time when Ares stood tall among the gods, not just as the bringer of battle, but as a protector of Olympus itself. In those ancient days, a monstrous enemy had risen, a creature born from the terrible womb of Echidna, the serpent nymph, whose poison was as cruel as her shape. This son of Echidna was no ordinary foe. He was shaped in 2 forms, a beast with twisted coils and a body that carried both the wild strength of giants and the deadly venom of serpents. Wherever he moved through the forests, the writhing shape of his mother's spine seemed to echo in the twist of his body. His feet were not feet at all, but coiling snakes, and with every step he hissed out a challenge to the gods. Kronos, the old enemy of the Thunderer, had sent this terrible creature as a living weapon to stand against the power of Zeus. With each motion, the monster stirred the sky and earth, a shadow stretching across the world, and he came hissing through the air, using his towering size to meet the bolts of Zeus, not with fear, but with roaring defiance. His hands rose high above his chest, broad and muscled, like mountain ridges, and he fought not with tricks, but with brute force, ready to claw and crush the king of the gods. His head reached so high that it broke through the clouds, and the skies that once belonged only to the birds and stars were darkened by his tangled hair, thick as twisted vines. So wild and dense was that hair that when birds flew too close, they were caught in it without escape, and he would gather them into his huge mouth as though they were nothing more than crumbs of meat for a beast meal. This was the creature that dared to challenge Olympus, a monster shaped by the fury of old powers, sent to overthrow the order of the skies. But Ares would not allow it. The god of war, brother of the Thunderer, stepped forward in defense of the heavens. With his great shield, soaked always in blood, and his arms full of wrath, he faced the enemy no one else dared approach. Ares, the destroyer of Titans, born for war, did not shrink before the monster's size or poison. He rose with a neck proud and unbending, a warrior who had spilled the blood of many, and he carried that same soaked shield into the heart of battle once more. The clash between them was no ordinary fight. It was sky shaking against earth, fire meeting fang. Ares, who had once joined the gods in the great war against the Titans, now fought not for conquest, but for protection. His movements were swift and brutal, his blows thundered like rolling stone, and with every strike the creature reeled. He fought as a champion of his father, not only in blood, but in battle, proving that though Zeus held the thunderbolt, it was Ares who carried war itself in his bones. In time, Ares brought down the beast, his weapon piercing through scales and poison, bringing low the nightmare sent by Kronos. It was no small feat, no easy win. The monster had clouded the sky and devoured the birds, a terror built from the old chaos, but Ares had stood his ground and struck true. In killing that masterpiece of monstrous blood, Ares proved himself not only a god of fury, but a protector of the gods' home. The victory was not sung in gentle words, but burned into the shield he carried, soaked now not only with the blood of mortals and Titans, but with the thick black poison of Echidna's child. And so, even in the high heavens, Ares lifted his head with pride, not just as the bringer of war, but as one who had fought to keep the balance of the cosmos safe, standing tall with the sky behind him and the battlefield beneath his feet. There was a time when the heavens and the earth clashed in a war so vast that its echoes were felt through mountains, skies, and seas, a time when the gods of Olympus rose against the mighty giants, the Gigantes, who were born of the deep earth and shaped in terrible form, their bodies tall as hills and their legs not of bone and flesh but of coiling serpents that twisted and hissed beneath them. In the wide plain of Phlegra, where the sun burned hot and the ground cracked with fire, this great war unfolded. Among the gods who stood at the front of this battle was Ares, the god of war, whose heart beat with the fury of combat and whose limbs moved with the rhythm of blood and steel. Ares, armed not just with spear and shield, but with the full force of his wrath, charged into the chaos where the giants roared, shaking the earth with every step. Against him rose one of the strongest of the Gigantes, Mimas, also called Mimon in painted scenes, a towering figure with serpent limbs and a heart full of rage against the gods. Mimas was not a creature who crept in shadows, but one who met his enemies face to face, a giant whose strength was matched only by his hatred and whose hands were as large as ships, ready to crush all that opposed him. The two met in the heart of battle, and there was no hesitation. Ares did not wait for commands or cries from Olympus. With eyes full of fire, he hurled himself at the giant, and Mimas roared in return, the sound splitting the air like thunder. Spears clashed, and the earth beneath them shook as serpent coils and armored limbs collided. Ares moved with fury, unyielding, his shield raised high and glinting with the red light of war. Mimas swung with all the weight of the mountains in his arms, but Ares met each blow, not stepping back, not faltering. Their battle was like the storm meeting the sea, violent and endless, until at last Ares, god of the spear, struck a blow so deep that it silenced even the giant's roar. Mimas fell, his massive form crashing onto the scorched plain, the coils of his legs writhing in their final death. The gods above shouted in victory, for one of their fiercest foes had fallen by the hand of Ares himself. But the god of war did not simply walk away. From the giant's fallen body, he claimed a piece of that terrible battle as a mark of his triumph. He took the armor he had worn in that great fight, stiff with blood and scorched by heat, and gave it as a gift, a symbol of strength and divine fury. That cuirass, forged in the fires of war and tested in the death of Mimas, did not vanish into myth. It was given to Aeetes, the king of Colchis, a man who ruled far from Phlegra, across the seas and past strange lands. When Aeetes prepared for his own trials, he placed that very cuirass upon his breast, the same armor Ares had worn when he faced the serpent-footed giant and slew him with his own hands. And in that armor lived the memory of a war so old the winds still whispered of it, a battle where gods bled, giants fell, and Ares stood unshaken in the field of fire, bringing death to the enemies of Olympus with his fury alone. The cuirass was not just metal, but the echo of divine war, soaked in memory, hardened by the fall of Mimas, and passed on to those who would face their own battles in distant times. In that way, the war of the gods did not end in silence, but lived on in steel and story, as Ares, the god who had looked into the eyes of the giant and did not blink, left behind more than blood. He left behind the mark of a warrior who conquered chaos in the name of Olympus. There came a time when the sky itself seemed to tremble, for Typhon, the monstrous storm-born creature, rose with fury in his heart and a single purpose, to seize the throne of Zeus and rule in place of the king of the gods. His power was vast, his strength beyond measure, and when he began his march toward Olympus, the gods looked upon his approach and knew that they could not stand against him. His form was towering, his steps shook the earth, and fire and wind swirled in his wake. Faced with such unstoppable might, fear spread like wildfire through the ranks of the immortals. One by one, the gods turned from Olympus and fled in terror, abandoning their thrones, their temples, and the mountain they once called home. Their flight carried them far across the world until they reached the land of Egypt, a place of deserts, wide rivers, and sacred beasts. But they knew Typhon would not stop. He would follow. And so, in desperation, they changed their forms, hiding themselves not in stone or shadow, but in the shapes of animals that belonged to that land. They cloaked themselves in forms sacred to Egypt, blending with its mysteries and silence. Apollon became a hawk, swift and sharp-eyed, taking to the skies as a bird that soared high and watched from above, his feathers catching the light of the sun he once guided. Hermes took the shape of an ibis, stepping through the shallows and reeds, his slender beak dipping into the waters as he walked with quiet thought, hidden in the calm. Ares, the god of war, fierce in battle and unshaken in chaos, now became something unexpected. A fish, the Lepidotus, slipping into the dark depths of the Nile's waters, his spear and shield left behind as he moved silently through the currents, vanishing among reeds and shadows. In this form, sacred in the land of Egypt, he found safety in motion, in quiet, in transformation. Ares, who had once roared across battlefields and shattered armies, now flicked his fins and waded beneath the surface, unseen. This was not cowardice, but survival, a moment when even the god of war knew the battle was not yet to be fought. Only two remained behind, unafraid and unmoved, Athena and Zeus, who faced Typhon not with disguise, but with defiance. But the others, in their animal forms, kept low, blending into the world of Egypt, where the old gods and sacred animals were honored and known. In this land, even the gods of Olympus could vanish, not by retreat, but by becoming part of something older, something deeper. As Typhon moved across the earth, seeking the gods who had once ruled over the skies, he searched for them in their old forms, unaware that they now swam, soared, and stepped through the sands and waters hidden by the wisdom of transformation. The god of war, now scaled and silent, waited beneath the surface, watching the storm above pass like a shadow across the face of the river. In that moment, the rage of Typhon could not touch him. The battlefield was water, not sky. The sword was fin, not iron. And Ares endured, not by striking, but by vanishing. Through this, the god survived the fury of Typhon. In time, the order of Olympus would be restored, and the war that could not be fought that day would return with a different tide. But in that dark hour, when even war itself became a fish in the deep, it was not strength or weapons that saved the gods, but the choice to bend, to become, and to wait. There was once a time when even Ares, the mighty god of war, the bringer of battle and storm, knew the weight of defeat not on the battlefield, but in the shame of chains. In the days when the sons of Aloeus, the giants Otus and Ephialtes, grew bold and reckless in their strength, they decided that not even the gods would stand above them. With hands that defied heaven and thoughts too proud for mortal minds, they declared war against Olympus. They did not lift weapons or armies in the usual way, but instead turned to the mountains themselves. With great force they heaved Mount Ossa atop Mount Olympus, and upon that they placed Mount Pelion, stone upon stone, peak upon peak, building a stair of mountains to reach the very sky. Their ambition knew no fear, and their eyes looked straight into the face of the divine. But their challenge did not end with building mountains, for they also captured Ares, the god no mortal ever dared to bind. With a plan dark and daring, they caught him, and in the moment of their triumph, they chained him. The bonds they forged were not light nor loose, but strong enough to hold even the god of war, who had stood unbroken in countless battles. They did not leave him out in the open, but threw him deep into a great bronze jar, a cauldron crafted not by gods, but as a prison on earth. There, sealed in silence, Ares lay, bound tightly, humiliated, hidden from sky and battle, the god who once roared like thunder, now trapped in darkness. 10 long months and 3 he remained inside that cauldron, each day heavier than the last, each hour stripping more strength from his limbs. Time passed slowly, and even war grew faint. No rescue came from Olympus, for even Zeus did not act. The king of the gods did not lift a hand, and Ares remained locked in the jar, his power growing cold, the proud fire of his spirit dimmed by defeat. His cries echoed only against bronze walls, heard by none except the earth itself. He was not only trapped by giants, but forgotten by gods. And it might have remained so had not Eriboia, the stepmother of the giants, one of surpassing beauty, come to learn of the gods' terrible fate. She, moved by pity or wisdom or fear, carried the news quietly to Hermes, the swift-footed god who walks between worlds. Hermes, cunning and silent, did not challenge the giants with force or threat. Instead, he stole into the place where Ares was hidden and broke the seals of that jar. He freed the god of war without word or warning, pulling him from the vessel where he had nearly wasted away. Ares, weak but breathing, emerged from the bronze prison not in triumph, but in silence, a god once mighty, now marked by chains and time. That very jar would later shine among the stars, remembered in the heavens as the constellation of the bowl, a reminder not of glory, but of defeat and endurance. It was said by some that the bowl in the sky is the very vessel in which Ares had been imprisoned, a quiet symbol that even the greatest can fall, and that war itself once lay helpless beneath the weight of giant hands. And so Ares, though a god of iron and flame, once knew stillness and shame, once lay in darkness without sword or shield. Not every tale of the gods is victory. Some are of survival, of bonds broken, and spirits scarred. Ares returned to Olympus, but he carried the memory of the jar with him, a mark not on his skin, but deep in his story, the god of war, who was once silenced, once shackled, and once saved not by battle, but by quiet mercy and cunning rescue. In a time when the gods still walked among men, and the boundary between life and death was a path that could be crossed. There lived a man in Corinth named Sisyphus, known not for strength or honor, but for cleverness sharper than any blade, and a tongue that never stayed silent. This man, more daring than wise, found himself tangled in the affairs of gods when he discovered a secret too great to keep. He saw with his own eyes that Zeus had taken Aegina, the daughter of the river god Asopus, carrying her off in silence. And instead of guarding that knowledge or keeping peace with the sky, Sisyphus chose to speak. He told Asopus the truth, breaking the silence that the king of the gods had expected. It was a small act, a handful of words, but it shook Olympus like thunder. Zeus, furious at the betrayal, did not strike with lightning as he often did. Instead, he sent Thanatos, death itself, to punish the mortal who dared to speak against the gods. Death came for Sisyphus quietly, not with fanfare or war, but with the stillness that marks his presence. Yet Sisyphus, ever full of tricks, was ready. He did not run or plead. Instead, he used his words again, weaving a trap with talk and clever hands. With skill and deceit, he bound Thanatos in chains so strong that even death could not break free, and when death was chained, all dying ceased. Across the world, no man fell, no beast passed away, no soul drifted into the underworld. Wounds did not claim soldiers, time did not claim the sick. The balance of life began to bend, and the gods took notice. The natural order trembled, for without death the world could not breathe. Sisyphus, proud and alive, walked the earth untouched, laughing in secret while the chains held tight. But in the halls of Olympus, unrest grew. The dead were meant to die, and the living were not meant to live forever. So it was Ares, the god of war, who rose to restore what had been broken. Ares, who brought death on the battlefield with each stroke of his blade, saw his work undone. War had no end, pain had no release, and the glory of combat was turned into mockery. Furious that his realm had been robbed of purpose, Ares descended not with an army, but alone, with fury in his heart and fire in his grip. He found Sisyphus and the bound death, and without trickery or talk, he struck. The chains were broken, the silence shattered, and death was freed once more. Sisyphus, now caught in the hands of fate, could not escape again. Ares seized him and delivered him into the power of Thanatos, ending the pause in the world's breath. Life and death resumed their rhythm, and Sisyphus was cast down into the realm below. But the story did not end there, for Sisyphus was not one to yield so easily. His punishment would follow, but it was Ares who restored the balance, who answered silence with action, and who made certain that no mortal, no matter how clever, could steal the power of death from the gods. In this tale, even the trickster found his end, not by thunder or judgment, but by the hand of war itself, a hand that would not allow death to be chained. There was once a time when the heavens trembled, not from war or thunder, but from insult, vengeance, and pride. At the birth of Hephaestus, the goddess Hera looked upon the child and saw that he was not like the other gods. His foot was twisted, his form imperfect, and her heart, filled with shame and disappointment, cast him from the heights of Olympus. He fell through the sky, down from the shining halls of the gods, and was left broken and alone. But from that fall, a fire within him grew. He did not fade or forget. In secret places beneath the earth, he built his strength not with sword or shield, but with flame, hammer, and forge. His hands, though once rejected, became skilled beyond all others, and in time he crafted wonders. When he was grown, he sent gifts back to Olympus, not as a son seeking love, but as a craftsman showing the power of his hands. Among these gifts was a golden throne, a magnificent seat fashioned for Hera herself. It gleamed with beauty and craft no god could match. But when Hera sat upon it, her pride turned to fear, for the throne held her fast, bound by invisible bonds of metal and magic. No god could free her. She was trapped, a queen held in place by the work of the sun she had cast away. Anger spread through Olympus, and to any god who could release her, Hera promised a prize beyond all others, the hand of Aphrodite in marriage. The gods stirred at this, but none more than Ares, the god of war, who had long felt drawn to the goddess of love. He burned with desire, not just to win the prize, but to bring back the brother who had dared to shame the queen of Olympus. Ares did not come with gifts or gentle words. He came in armor wrapped in fury and sought to drag Hephaestus back by force. But the god of fire did not tremble. From his forge he hurled burning shards of molten metal, sharp and searing, a storm of flame that even Ares could not withstand. The god of war, who had never been turned back by spear or sword, was driven into retreat. His companions, Deimos and Phobos, fear and panic, and even the spirit of battle noise itself, Kidoimos, followed behind him. But none could pierce the wall of fire. Hephaestus, once cast down, now stood above them all. In the silence that followed, it was Dionysus who stepped forward, not with weapons, but with wine and words. He spoke not of war, but of reward. Hephaestus, he said, should return to Olympus willingly and claim the bride that had been promised. The fire god agreed. He rose not with rage but with purpose, and walked once more through the gates of Olympus, not as an exile, but as a victor. Aphrodite, the shining goddess, was given to him, though not of her own choosing. In the union forged by bargain and pride, joy did not follow. Neither Ares nor Aphrodite was pleased, and though the gods watched and the vows were spoken, their hearts burned elsewhere. In the shadows of Olympus, the two returned to each other in secret. Ares and Aphrodite began their affair, hidden beneath the eyes of the heavens, bound not by duty, but by desire that would not fade. Even their child attendants, fear, panic, and the din of war, could not protect Ares from the sting of humiliation he felt at being cast aside. And just as they had followed him into battle, they too shared in the shame when Hephaestus stood unshaken, unafraid, a god once broken now, rising above war itself. In that tangled tale of rejection, revenge, fire, and forbidden love, no one truly triumphed, for even the gods carry wounds not made by weapons, and sometimes the hardest bonds to break are not those made of gold or metal, but pride, passion, and pain. Long ago, before mortal men gathered in crowds to cheer and compete in the dust of Olympia, the very first games were not held by mortals at all, but by the gods themselves. It was a time when the old powers were falling, when Kronos had been defeated and the throne of the heavens passed to Zeus, who had led the charge against the ancient ruler. Some say Zeus wrestled with Kronos in this very place, grappling not just for victory, but for the fate of the cosmos itself, and others say that after the victory was won, Zeus chose to honor that great triumph, not with a monument or a war, but with celebration, by holding games in the fields of Olympia. These were not games of men, but of gods, each stepping forward to show not only strength, but glory, speed, and skill. The names that filled the lists of champions were not those of heroes, but of the immortals who shaped the world. Among them stood Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy, who, though known for his calm and radiant nature, entered the contests of the gods and proved himself not with song or speech, but with action. When the race was called, Apollo stood beside Hermes, the swift messenger, the god of travelers whose feet moved faster than thought. Yet when they ran, Apollo outran him, leaving even the god of speed behind in the dust. But Apollo did not stop there. In the contests of strength, he faced Ares himself, the god of war, whose hands had broken armies and whose fists had struck down giants. The two met in the boxing ring where there were no swords, no shields, only fists and will. Ares entered the fight with pride, expecting to win by force alone, but Apollo, graceful and firm, stood his ground. Blow after blow rang out across the plain, each hit echoing with divine force, and still Apollo did not fall. He struck back with calm precision, not wild fury, and in the end it was the god of light who stood victorious, and the god of war who had tasted defeat. His name was carved into the memory of those games as the one who had outrun Hermes and beaten Ares, not with weapons, but with skill, not in war, but in sport. And so the very first games held in Olympia were marked not by mortals striving to imitate gods, but by the gods themselves who showed that victory does not always come through power alone. Through these contests, they honored the passing of one age into another, the fall of Kronos and the rise of Zeus, and in that celebration of strength, speed, and glory, the spirit of the games was born, a spirit that would later echo through time as men gathered on the same ground trying in their own way to match the steps and blows of gods. There were moments on Olympus when the clang of swords fell silent, when the storm of war gave way to the rhythm of joy, and the gods, eternal and powerful, gathered not for battle or judgment, but for celebration, song, and dance. In such moments, the peaks of Olympus were alive with music and laughter, and the halls of the gods glowed with golden light. The Muses stood together, each voice rising and falling in harmony, weaving songs of divine gifts and eternal pleasures, their melodies stretching into the sky. The Graces danced beside the seasons, joined by the soft steps of Harmonia, the youthful joy of Hebe, and the radiant beauty of Aphrodite, who moved with grace that stirred both hearts and heavens. Among this circle of delight, Artemis lifted her voice in song, while Apollo, bright as the sun itself, played his lyre with fingers that stirred the stars, every string a beam of light, every note a blessing of calm. Even Hermes, ever watchful, joined the dance, his eyes flashing like silver as he spun among the gods. And in their midst moved Ares, god of war, whose usual roar and fury were left behind. Here, in the peace of Olympus, he did not carry shield or spear. His hands were empty of iron, and his laughter rang clear. At the feasts of the gods, even the war god danced, not with rage but with joy, stepping lightly to the music of the divine. At such gatherings, Ganymede, the beautiful boy of Troy, cupbearer to the immortals, moved with grace among the tables, offering wine drawn from the heavens themselves. Ares, who had tasted the blood of 1,000 wars, now drank deeply from the boy's cup, not in thirst for conquest, but in pleasure, accepting the drink with a rare peace in his eyes. Even the king of the gods drank in that stillness, and the halls rang with contentment. When the wedding of Peleus and Thetis drew the gods together once more, the sea and the sky sent forth their divine hosts. Zeus left his high throne, Poseidon rose from his watery halls, and all the gods came to honor the bride, whose beauty matched the waves, whose lineage was shared with the queen of the deep. Ganymede poured wine again, his hands sure and smooth, and the gods raised their cups in unity. Ares came too, not as the destroyer, not as the ironclad warrior, but as a guest, a brother, a god at peace. He came without his helmet, without his breastplate or sword, bare of the weight that war had given him, smiling and unarmed. He danced like the others, his feet light on the floor, his step easy, and though he was the same Ares who had shattered shields and broken mountains, in that moment he was simply one of the immortals, swaying to the rhythm of joy, not fury. The halls echoed not with the din of battle, but with the music of Apollo's strings and the soft steps of the gods. And so, within the heart of Olympus and at the edge of the sea, the gods knew not only power and punishment, but celebration. Even Ares, born for war, held his breath to sing, set down his arms to dance, and lifted his cup in the golden calm of divine festivity. In the high places of the sky, Hera burned with rage, her heart heavy with jealousy and wounded pride, for among all the women who had borne children to Zeus, none stirred her wrath more deeply than Leto, the gentle daughter of Koios. It was whispered that Leto would give birth to a son who would shine brighter than Ares, a child who would one day hold a bow of silver light and draw worship from every corner of the earth. This prophecy cut deep into Hera's pride, for even her own son, the god of war, would be outshined by the child of this quiet, wandering goddess. So, filled with fury, Hera rose up in the heavens and swore to stop the birth, to let no place under sky or star welcome Leto in her hour of pain. With her own hands she chained the goddess of childbirth so that no aid could reach Leto, and then she stationed her watchers across the wide world to ensure no refuge could be found. Ares, grim and watchful, took his place on the high peak of Thracian Hemos, fully armed and cold as iron. There he sat, eyes scouring the land, while his horses were tethered in the caves of the northern wind. On the far-flung islands, Iris, swift-footed and gleaming, watched from the heights of Mimas, her presence like a storm waiting to break. Together they guarded the earth and sea, casting fear upon every city and shore Leto tried to approach. Town after town closed their gates, island after island turned their backs, terrified by the threats of the goddess and her two divine enforcers. Still, Leto wandered, heavy with child, her strength failing, seeking any place that would offer shelter as the pains of birth began to grip her. Her journey brought her to the flowing river Peneus in the green lands of Thessaly. There she knelt, crying out for mercy, and the river, moved by her suffering, answered with gentle resolve. Though trembling beneath the weight of Hera's warning, Peneus offered his waters, his banks, his heart. He promised to endure, to protect, and even stilled his mighty current to make a place of peace for her. But Ares, ever watchful from the mountaintop, saw this act of defiance and was stirred to wrath. With a roar like thunder, he rose from his post and prepared to punish the river's compassion. He reached for the very roots of Mount Pangaeon, ready to hurl its peaks into the waters below and choke the river in stone. His shield rang out with a terrible din as he struck it with the tip of his spear, a sound so fierce it sent shivers through the land. Mountains trembled, plains shook, and all of Thessaly seemed to dance with fear. The sound rolled like the smoldering groan of Mount Etna when the giant buried deep beneath it shifts in his sleep and the forges of Hephaestus roar with fire. The clash of metal echoed across the land like the fall of 100 anvils, and still the river stood fast, unmoved by terror. Though the god of war towered above him in rage, Peneus did not flee. He remained, unmoving, a guardian of mercy. But Leto, worn by pain and knowing the price he would pay, cried out for him to let her go. She urged him to protect himself, to release her from his care before Hera's fury brought him ruin. With sadness she rose once more, her journey not yet ended, leaving the river behind with words of farewell and promise that his kindness would not be forgotten. And so the god of war resumed his watch, his threats unanswered, and Leto continued her search beneath the eyes of gods, still seeking a place where the twin lights within her might finally enter the world. Heracles and Ares, though sharing the blood of Zeus, often found themselves locked in fierce conflict, a tension between the god of war and his mortal half-brother playing out across many battles and stories. Among the great deeds that marked Heracles' life were tasks that brought him into direct confrontation with the children of Ares, fierce and wild beings born of the god of war's power. 2 of Heracles' 12 labors involved these fierce offspring. The first was the capture of the man-eating mares belonging to King Diomedes of Bastonia in the land of Thrace, creatures so savage they devoured any man who dared approach. Heracles, with strength and courage unmatched, subdued these terrifying beasts, taming what seemed untamable and bringing them under his control. The second labor took him to the distant realm of the Amazons, where he sought the belt of their queen, Antiope, a prize earned only through great challenge and battle. In his quest, Heracles slew the warriors who guarded the belt, many of whom were said to be children of Ares themselves. Fierce and formidable fighters, bred from the god's own bloodline. These acts were not mere feats of strength. They were symbolic confrontations between the mortal champion and the divine power of war itself, a struggle between the will of a man and the fury of a god. But their conflicts were not limited to Heracles' labors. The poet Hesiod tells of a fierce battle at the sandy shores of Pylos, where Heracles faced Ares himself. The god of war came at him with a rage like no other, but Heracles stood firm, spear in hand. The battle raged, and 3 times Heracles' spear struck Ares' shield, knocking him down. Yet the final blow was the most terrible. With all his might, Heracles thrust his spear into Ares' thigh, splitting it open and sending the god headlong into the dust. Though a god might seem invincible, Heracles had wounded him deeply, bringing shame upon Ares had he fallen completely. This fight marked not only the strength of Heracles, but the vulnerability even in gods, revealing the mortal's fierce heart and the god's fury, wounded by human might. The strife between Heracles and Ares did not end there. for the god of war stood by his kin in other battles. Ares supported his son Kychnos in a fierce fight against Hercules, defending his child against the hero's strength. Their clash echoed the ongoing tension between the realms of gods and men, blood relations torn by battle and loyalty. The story of Kychnos, son of Ares, and his struggle with Hercules is told with many twists, but it stands as another chapter in the ongoing conflict between these two powerful figures. In another tale from the lands of Greece, Ares lent his support to Aloadae, the river god, when he faced Hercules in combat. The Megarians, proud of their heritage, built a treasury at Olympia and filled it with offerings that told this story in small cedar wood figures, carefully inlaid with gold to show the divine drama. Among these figures were Zeus, the father of all gods, Deianira, the mortal wife of Hercules, Aloadae himself, Hercules the hero, and Ares, standing firm to aid the river god against the mortal champion. This scene captured the powerful clash between divine forces and heroic strength, a moment frozen in gold and wood to remind all who came that even gods would join battle alongside mortals, each side claiming their right and their power. Through these stories, the conflict between Hercules and Ares is not just a tale of rivalry, but a dance of fate and power, where gods and men meet on fields of battle, each testing the limits of strength and will. Hercules, though mortal, walked among gods and dared to wound the very god of war, while Ares, god of battle, moved to defend his kin and his honor, drawing lines between blood and fury, love and conflict that shaped the legends of old. During the Great War known as the Seven against Thebes, when the city of Thebes was under the shadow of destruction and despair, a dire need fell upon the people to seek guidance beyond their own strength. The city was tormented by plagues and famine, as if the very earth had turned against them, and the royal family was wrapped in a shroud of misfortune. In this time of desperation, the Thebans turned to the blind prophet Tiresias, a seer whose wisdom was said to reach beyond the mortal realm. Tiresias spoke a solemn truth to the people. Victory and peace would come only if a sacrifice was made, a sacrifice from the blood of the ancient Spartoi, the fierce warriors sprung from the earth itself, born from the dragon's teeth sown long ago. Among these descendants was Menwechus, the son of Creon, noble and brave, and he understood the heavy weight that fate had placed upon his shoulders. The prophet's words were clear. Only if Menwechus gave himself willingly to Ares, the god of war, by offering his own life, would Thebes be spared from ruin and the plague that strangled its lands. With no hesitation, Menwechus made his choice. In an act of courage and love for his city, he climbed the walls that guarded Thebes and cast himself down before the city gates, sacrificing his life to appease the god and save his people. His death was not in vain, for with his passing, the terrible scourge began to lift, and the people of Thebes found new hope. The warriors of the city, inspired by such a sacrifice, fought with renewed strength and determination against the invading armies. The Thebans won the battle that once seemed impossible, their victory sealed by the selfless act of Menwechus, who gave all so that others might live. This story, told again by the mythographer Hyginus, speaks of the deep ties between blood, sacrifice, and the favor of gods in times of war. He recounts how Oedipus, unknowingly entwined in tragedy, left a cursed legacy, but through the sacrifice of Menwechus, descended from the fierce Spartoi, the city could find release from its suffering. Even as crops failed and despair gripped the hearts of Thebans, the prophet's words illuminated a path to salvation, a path walked by a single man who bore the burden of a nation on his shoulders. And so, in the midst of the siege and the cries of battle, Menwechus threw himself from the walls, a final act of devotion that brought victory to Thebes and ended the darkness that had threatened to consume it. His sacrifice became a symbol, remembered through the ages as the price paid for peace, a testament to the strength of one to save many, and the will of gods answered through mortal courage. After the great fall of Troy, many wandered far from their homes, seeking refuge or new lands to claim, but not all found safety. One such wanderer was Diomedes, cast upon the wild Libyan coast, where a fierce king named Lycos ruled. This king followed a cruel and terrible custom. He sacrificed strangers to his father, the god of war, Ares. To honor his fierce divine parent, Lycos offered up those who came to his land, strangers and travelers alike, as victims in dark rituals meant to please the god of battle and bloodshed. This grim practice was well known among the peoples of the region, as recorded by the historian Juba, who wrote of it in his account of Libya. In the mountains and passes of Thessaly lived another son of Ares, Kychnos, a man as fearsome as the god himself. Kychnos followed a brutal way of honoring his father by beheading any strangers who dared cross his path. These cruel acts were not random violence, but part of a dark purpose. With the skulls of the fallen, Kychnos built a terrible temple dedicated to Phobos, the god of panic and fear, who was himself a son of Ares. Each skull was a tribute, a monument to the dread that war brings upon the hearts of men, and through this ghastly shrine, Kychnos sought to bind the power of terror to his own will and honor the divine forces that ruled over war and fear. Such stories of sacrifice and violence were echoed elsewhere, as in the tale of Oinomaus, who was known for slaying the suitors who sought his daughter's hand in marriage. Though less is said about the reasons for his deeds, it is suggested that these acts might have been offerings to his father Ares, in hopes of securing favor or strength in battle. The spilling of blood as tribute to the god of war was a grim but powerful tradition in many lands. In the story of Aeetes, king of Colchis, we find another harsh example. Like those before him, Aeetes sacrificed strangers to Ares and to Phobos, continuing the cruel customs of honoring the fierce gods with the lives of outsiders. These sacrifices were part of the fabric of his rule, a way to maintain power and show devotion to the harsh gods who governed war and fear. Through these acts of violence, kings and warriors sought the favor of Ares and his fearful son, binding themselves to the gods of battle through offerings made in blood. The stories remind us of the dark side of war, where sacrifice and terror walk hand in hand, and where strangers could become victims in the service of gods who demand fierce loyalty and homage. These ancient tales paint a picture of a world where the power of the divine was honored not only with songs and praise, but with lives given in sacrifice, a grim testament to the strength and terror that Ares and his sons represented. Now, as the high-hearted Trojans watched the two armies gather on the plain before the gates of Troy, the tension in the air began to grow heavy. Ares, the god of war, stood among them in the form of a mortal warrior. His presence felt like the weight of steel pressing on every shoulder. His armor glinted like fire under the sun, though at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis he had once danced smilingly, unarmed, without spear or sword. That moment of joy was distant now. Back then, all the gods had gathered in celebration of the union between the mortal Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. Zeus had commanded Ganymede to pour the wine, and gods from all corners of the cosmos came to honor the white-armed bride. Even Poseidon left the sea, and Ares set aside his armor and danced light and free. But peace did not last. Eris, the goddess of discord, cast a golden apple among the goddesses, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," sparking a rivalry that sowed the seeds of war. That apple led to a judgment, a choice, and eventually to the taking of Helen, which dragged all of Greece and Troy into conflict. Ares, the god of blood and fury, now watched the consequences unfold. At first he had promised Hera and Athena, his own mother and sister, that he would take the side of the Greeks. He had assured them that he would fight for the Argives and crush the Trojans beneath his wrath. But love is often stronger than promises, and Aphrodite, with her beauty and whispers, turned his heart. She begged him to defend the Trojans, and he agreed, betraying his word to Hera and Athena. The battlefield became his stage once again, but now he fought for the other side. As the armies clashed, the sounds of swords striking shields and the screams of the dying filled the air. Ares moved through the ranks of Trojan soldiers, driving them forward, filling their hearts with rage and courage. he was not alone. With him came Deimos, the spirit of terror, and Phobos, the embodiment of fear. Eris followed too, hate etched into her every movement, a shadow to her brother Ares. The Greeks held their ground, led by heroes like Diomedes. In the thick of battle, Athena came to Diomedes and guided his spear. With divine aid, Diomedes struck Ares, wounding the god of war. The blow echoed through the field, and even the immortals felt the shock. Ares let out a terrible cry, louder than 1,000 men. His pain was real, deep, and raw, and he fled the battlefield, retreating to Olympus to tend his wound. Athena, cold and determined, accused him of treachery, of breaking his word to their mother, and now paying the price. Ares, shamed and injured, disappeared from the battle, his absence felt in the waning strength of the Trojan lines. The war raged on, but the power of Ares had been checked. From the joyful dance at a wedding feast to the blood-soaked soil outside Troy, the journey of Ares through the Trojan War was one of passion, betrayal, fury, and defeat. Though a god, he was swayed by love, wounded by mortals, and judged by his own kin. His role in the Trojan War was not just one of violence, but of choices, divided loyalties, and the endless pull between love and duty. The gods may have stood above men, but in their hearts, they were often just as tangled in desire, pride, and vengeance. Ares, the iron god of war, would always find himself at the center of battle, but in this war, even he could bleed. The sons of Dares were among the first to face the fury of the Greeks in the heat of battle, and when one of them was cut down by the side of his chariot, while the other ran in fear, it stirred the hearts of the Trojans with deep anger and grief. They had watched their own fall, and it made them burn with the desire to strike back. But amidst the chaos, the goddess with gray eyes, calm and wise, took the hand of Ares, the god of war. She held him firmly, her presence strong despite the blood that covered the field around them. She spoke to him, and her voice, though steady, carried the weight of wisdom and warning. She reminded him that it was not for them, the gods, to control the fate of the mortals below. It was for Zeus alone to decide which side would win glory and which would fall in shame. She told Ares that they should both leave the battle and step back before they brought down the anger of Zeus upon themselves. And so, with some hesitation, but respecting her will, Ares was led away from the fight. He no longer charged through the soldiers, no longer drove fear into the hearts of men. Instead, Athena caused him to sit quietly beside the sands of the river Scamandros, watching from a distance as the Greeks began to push back the Trojans with renewed strength. Meanwhile, Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and love, had entered the battle not for war, but to save her son Aeneas. But the war did not spare even the gods. The hero Diomedes, filled with the courage of Athena, saw Aphrodite on the field and, not fearing her divinity, struck her with his spear. The wound was not deep, but for an immortal, it brought shock and pain unlike anything she had felt before. Blood, dark and unnatural, welled on her skin, and she cried out as the pain spread through her. She could not stay. Iris, swift-footed and loyal, saw her suffering and took her hand gently, guiding her away from the battle, away from the fury that had consumed the plain. As they moved from the fighting, they found Ares, still sitting in silence where Athena had left him. His spear stood beside him, lost in the mist, and his golden horses waited near. Aphrodite, still bleeding and pale, dropped to one knee before her brother, her voice filled with pain and plea. She begged him to help her, to give her his gold-bridled horses so she might flee the pain and return to Olympus, where the gods could heal her wounds. She told him of the mortal who had dared to strike her, the son of Typhoeus, who had grown so bold he would even raise a spear against Zeus himself if given the chance. Ares listened, and though anger stirred within him, he said nothing. He simply gave her the horses, and she climbed into the chariot, still holding her injured wrist. Iris joined her, gathering the reins, and with a crack of the whip, the horses soared, eager and swift, pulling the chariot high above the battlefield. As they reached the high home of the gods, the bright peak of Olympus, Iris slowed the horses, slipping them from the yoke, and gave them the food of immortals to restore their strength. Ares watched them go, his heart still burning with the weight of battle. But the war did not wait. Soon after, Apollo, another god who favored the Trojans, came to Ares. He too had faced the fury of Diomedes, who now seemed more than mortal. Apollo, his voice sharp with warning, called to Ares, calling him by all his names: Destroyer, Blood-stained One, Breaker of Walls. He asked if Ares could truly stay still while this one man, this son of Tydeus, wounded gods and cut down warriors without fear. Diomedes had struck Aphrodite and had even dared to fight against Apollo himself. Ares, hearing this, could not hold back his rage any longer. He rose from his place and took the form of a swift-footed warrior from Thrace, Achamas, and made his way down to the field once more. His eyes were set on the battle, and his voice called out to the sons of Troy, the children of the old king, who had ruled long and seen much. Ares urged them on, reminding them of who they were and how long they had stood proud. He asked them how they could allow the Greeks to keep killing their people, how they could wait until the enemy stood right at their gates. His words stirred their hearts, reminding them of the warriors they had once honored, who now lay dead on the ground. The anger and the grief swelled again in the hearts of the Trojans, and they looked to Ares, not knowing he was a god in disguise, and felt their courage return. The war had turned again, the gods watching and weaving fate with every breath. From the fall of one man beside his chariot to the silent retreat of the god of war, from the wounded beauty of Aphrodite to the furious return of Ares under a new face, each moment pulled the thread of the war tighter, drawing every man and god closer to the end that Zeus alone would decide. The battlefield was soaked with blood, both mortal and divine, and above it all, the gods moved like shadows, unseen by most, but felt in every strike, every cry, every choice. Hector, strong and shining, called out to Aeneas, son of mighty Anchises, and urged him to join the fight and help recover their fallen companion from the battlefield, where blood and dust covered everything. His words were heavy with urgency and stirred the courage of those who heard them. The call to rescue one of their own sparked a fire in their hearts, and they rose with fresh strength, ready to throw themselves once more into the chaos of war. Around them the Trojans began to press forward, their hands gripping spears and shields tighter than ever. The gods were watching, and one of them was not just watching, but walking among them. Ares, god of war, moved with them, hidden in the darkness that cloaked the battlefield like a thick night. He had come to fight for the Trojans, and he did so under the command of Apollo, the god with the silver bow and golden sword, who had sent him to bring energy and fury back into the hearts of the Trojans. Apollo had seen that Athena was no longer on the field, and with her gone, the balance had shifted. Now Ares moved with freedom, stirring anger, courage, and the will to fight into every Trojan he passed. The fight that followed was like no other. Hate itself walked the battlefield, as the goddess Eris, whose wrath has no end, also joined the fray. Alongside her was Ares, who delighted in battle, in the sound of shields breaking and men crying out, and in the sight of swords flashing through the thick of battle. The will to fight, awakened by Apollo, made the Trojans fierce, and Ares gave them the strength to push the Greeks back step by step. On the Greek side, Menelaus stood among the champions, his armor bright with bronze, his spear shaking in his hand. He did not move without fear, but the fury of Ares pushed him forward anyway, driving him like a storm. He marched toward Aeneas, ready to face him, though Ares was near and watching. The battle raged, and the sound of shouting men and clashing metal never stopped. Then Hector, the warrior prince of the Trojans, shouted loud and clear, driving his own men forward. The battalions followed him with all their strength, and at the front of them, leading them into the heart of the Greek line, was Ares himself, walking like a man, fighting like a god. At his side was Enyo, the goddess of war's destruction, who carried the madness and confusion that comes with bloodshed. Ares held a great spear in his hands, moving alongside Hector, and sometimes leading, sometimes following, always bringing chaos with him. Diomedes, the Greek hero, blessed by Athena with the rare gift to see gods as they moved among men, saw Ares clearly and shivered. He had the heart of a warrior, but the sight of a god in the thick of battle chilled even him. He knew that no man, no matter how brave, could fight a god and hope to win. He called out to his fellow Greeks, reminding them of Hector's skill and bravery, but also warning them that it was not just Hector they faced. Ares was beside him, disguised in human form, but divine and deadly. Diomedes told his people to stand firm, but also to be wise, not to charge forward blindly against a god who could strike down dozens with a single sweep of his hand. So the Greeks, though brave, began to fall back, giving ground slowly as they kept their faces to the enemy, refusing to break, but knowing the odds were not in their favor. With Ares at their side and Hector leading the charge, the Trojans attacked with growing confidence. The Greeks did not flee, but they could not stand and fight as they had before. The force of Ares was too great, and their lines began to bend under the weight of his fury. Hector and Ares led the slaughter, killing Greek after Greek. The first to fall under their wrath was Teuthras, who fought with great skill but could not stop a god. Then came Orestes, who drove chariots with speed and grace, but whose speed could not outrun a spear. Trecos, the spearman from Aetolia, stood his ground and cast his spear with precision, but it was not enough. Oinomaus, a proud warrior, met the same fate. Then Helenus, the son of Oenops, fell, his shield broken, his breath gone. Finally, Oresbius, with his bright armor and determined heart, also went down in the dust and blood of the battlefield. The sight of so many warriors falling, the cries of the wounded, the sound of bronze clashing with bronze, it all reached the high halls of Olympus, where the gods watched in silence. Hera, queen of the gods, with white arms and sharp eyes, looked down and saw the Greeks falling, saw the tide turning in favor of the Trojans. Her heart burned with anger and concern. She turned to Athena, daughter of Zeus, and reminded her of the promise they had made, the word they had given to Menelaus, that they would help him, that the Greeks would return home only after destroying the strong walls of Troy. Now that promise seemed broken, fading in the dust of defeat, and Hera, proud and powerful, could no longer stay still. The war had reached a point where even the gods could not watch without being moved. The fate of the Greeks was hanging in the balance, and Ares was tipping the scale with every step, every swing of his giant spear, every heartbeat that pushed blood through the veins of the warriors who followed him. The sky above the battlefield stayed heavy, and the earth below drank the blood of both mortal and divine. If they were to allow cursed Ares to continue raging through the battlefield with such wild fury, then there would be no end to the destruction and death. So, instead of letting fear or despair take hold, the goddesses chose to focus on their own strength and courage. With hearts steady and a clear sense of purpose, they turned toward Troy to help the Greeks, determined to balance the scales that had been tilted by Ares' violent hand. As they moved, they passed Zeus high upon the peak of Olympus, watching everything from above like the silent judge of all that lived and fought below. Hera, riding in her chariot drawn by strong horses, paused and looked upon the father of gods and men. She asked him directly if he was not angered by the way Ares had unleashed chaos and death, killing so many noble Greek warriors without reason, and not in accordance with any rightful order of battle. She reminded Zeus that, while Ares ran wild, others like Aphrodite and Apollo sat in peace and ease, letting Ares go loose without restraint, causing her deep grief. Then she asked whether he would be angry if she herself were to strike Ares down with hard blows and drive him away from the battlefield. Zeus, calm but firm, answered her and gave his permission. He told her to send forth Athena, the one who brings pain and defeat more harshly than any other. He trusted Athena to do what must be done, for her strength in battle and her discipline in war made her the perfect one to stand against Ares. Hera, hearing these words, did not wait. She immediately urged her horses forward and descended to the field of Troy, where the cries of the wounded and the clash of bronze never ceased. Athena also came down to the earth, taking form and presence, and she appeared before Diomedes, the Greek hero who had already fought bravely and had once wounded a goddess with his spear. She reminded him that she stood beside him once again, urging him not to hold back, but to fight the Trojans with confidence, for he was not alone. Diomedes recognized her instantly and responded with full honesty, telling her that it was not fear or weakness that made him pause. It was the memory of her own command, when she had warned him never to raise his hand against any immortal unless it was Aphrodite. And now he had seen Ares himself on the battlefield, in full fury, leading the enemy, and he had withdrawn the Greek warriors to his side, preparing to face whatever came next. He explained that it was not cowardice, but obedience and caution that made him stop. Then Athena, her eyes full of cold light, answered him with force and clarity. She called him the son of Typhoeus, a warrior she favored, and told him to put aside all fear. She promised to stand beside him not only as a guide, but as a protector, and urged him to strike Ares directly. She reminded him of Ares' lies and broken promises, how he had once told her and Hera that he would fight for the Greeks, only to abandon that vow and now stand with the Trojans. She called Ares a creature of fury and deceit and urged Diomedes to be bold. She told him to take the fight to Ares, not to avoid him, but to steer his chariot straight at the god of war himself. With that she acted. She pushed aside Sthenelus, Diomedes' loyal charioteer, sending him gently from the chariot with a divine touch. He landed safely, knowing better than to protest, and stepped back. Then Athena, still burning with purpose, stepped into the chariot beside Diomedes. Her presence made the wood groan with energy, the oaken axle shaking as her divine form took its place beside the mortal warrior. Now with the goddess in the chariot, the scene was set. Diomedes gripped his spear tightly, and Athena, with eyes like storm clouds, directed the horses forward. The chariot raced across the field, through dust and blood, through broken shields and fallen men, not stopping, not slowing, heading straight for Ares. Around them the war still raged, the cries of battle rising into the sky. But in that moment there was a stillness between the thunder of hooves, a sense of purpose that cut through the noise like a sharp blade. Diomedes did not look back, and Athena's grip on the reins was steady. They had one goal: to confront Ares, to bring him down, and to restore balance to the battlefield. The god who had caused so much grief and suffering was about to face the one who could truly stand against him. And though he was a god, made of divine power and wrath, he would not be untouchable. Not now, not with Athena at Diomedes' side. The moment had come, and the battle, though filled with confusion and terror, would soon feel the weight of divine justice. The wheels of the chariot spun faster, the horse's breath steamed in the air, and the spear of Diomedes gleamed with a light that did not come from the sun, but from something older, deeper, and stronger. The chariot groaned beneath the great weight it carried, bearing both the dread goddess and the mighty man of war. It was a sound heavy with purpose, with the pressure of divine will and mortal strength combined. Athena, fierce and unshaken, seized the whip and reins without hesitation, guiding the single-footed horses forward in a swift and straight path that cut through the chaos of the battlefield. She aimed them directly at Ares, the god of war himself, who stood blood-soaked and cruel in the middle of the field. Ares was in the very act of stripping the armor from the giant Periphas, a shining warrior and the finest among the men of Aetolia. The war god had cut him down just moments before, ending his life and laying his body on the earth. And now he was beginning to remove the arms from the fallen hero, his hands stained with death and victory. But Athena, hidden behind the helm of death, which even the sharpest divine eye could not pierce, approached silently. This helm, a gift from the world below, made her invisible to Ares, cloaking her presence entirely, for she knew Ares would strike without restraint if he saw her coming. Now as Ares lifted his gaze, he saw Diomedes approaching in his chariot. the hero shining with the strength that only divine favor could give. Diomedes burned with courage, and Ares, letting the body of Periphas fall where it lay, turned his fury toward the new challenger. He gripped his bronze spear tightly, and with a wild shout he charged, lunging across the yoke of his horses, thrusting with all the force of his immortal rage toward Diomedes, eager to take the hero's life. But before the weapon could find its mark, Athena, sharp-eyed and swift, reached out and caught the spear in her divine hand. With a simple push, calm and exact, she deflected the attack. The tip of the spear veered away, striking nothing, and Ares' blow landed in vain. He had missed. Now Diomedes, son of Typhoeus and bold in battle, rose to return the strike. His own spear gleamed with polished bronze, and he hurled it forward with all his might. Athena, leaning into the throw, added her power to his, guiding the weapon straight and true. She aimed it at the god's midsection, where his war belt wrapped around him. The spear struck deep, sinking into the flesh below the belt, a place not fully protected even on a god's body. It pierced through the skin, the divine ichor flowing out in silver drops that shimmered in the air. With a cry of both rage and pain, Ares recoiled, and Diomedes yanked the spear back out of the wound. What followed shook the entire battlefield. Ares, struck and bleeding, let out a bellow that rolled over the plain like thunder, a sound greater than the voices of 9,000 men, or even 10,000, all shouting at once in the madness of war. The cry was so loud, so full of agony and fury, that both Greeks and Trojans froze in their tracks. Their feet trembled, and for a moment all battle ceased as they looked toward the place where the god had been wounded. Fear spread through the soldiers like a wave, for none could hear such a sound without feeling the pull of death close by. The earth seemed to still, and then, like a storm rising after a long, hot day, the sky grew dark above the field. Ares lifted himself up, his figure dissolving into the clouds as he left the battlefield behind. Wounded, he rose toward Olympus, vanishing into the wide heavens. The god who had brought so much bloodshed now fled the field, wounded by a mortal hand, guided by the will of another god. He came swiftly to the citadel of the gods, the peak of Olympus, where the immortals dwelled. There he found Zeus, seated high, and sat beside him, aching in body and heavy in spirit. The ichor, blood of the gods, still flowed from the wound made by the mortal spear. In sorrow and anger Ares spoke, not with the roar of war, but with the words of a god in pain. He questioned why such things were allowed to happen, why the gods who should stand above such violence had to suffer wounds and grief because of one another. He blamed Zeus, the father of them all, saying that it was his doing. He claimed that it was Zeus who had allowed this to happen, for it was Zeus who had brought forth Athena, a daughter filled with fury, always seeking to strike without justice. Ares said that all the gods obeyed Zeus, all bowed to his will, and still he let Athena run wild, unchecked, causing pain even to her own kind. Ares reminded Zeus that Diomedes, the son of Typhoeus, had not acted alone. He had been driven by Athena, encouraged to strike out not just against mortals, but against the gods themselves. First he had wounded Aphrodite, piercing her arm with cold bronze, and now he had done even more, lashing out at Ares and drawing divine blood. Ares, blood-stained and humiliated, sat in the presence of the king of the gods, not as a proud warrior, but as one wounded by betrayal, calling out against the one who had made his pain possible. The battlefield still echoed with the sound of his cry, but now he sat far away from the war, removed from the fighting, not in victory, but in bitter defeat. Then he came on like something more than a man, a force of destruction so great that it seemed no mortal could ever hope to stand against it. And he charged even at me, with the rage of a storm behind his eyes, and the bronze spear flashing in his hand, ready to strike without mercy. But I, swift of foot and sharp of mind, moved away just in time, slipping out of the path of his fury, and so I was spared. Otherwise I would have already been lying among the dead, pierced and groaning, lifeless on the battlefield, or worse, still breathing but broken, left without strength and crushed by the brutal weight of his spear. When Ares, wounded and furious, reached the heights of Olympus and came before Zeus, the Lord of the Clouds looked at him with cold eyes, and his face turned dark as he spoke, not with comfort, but with stern words filled with truth. He told Ares not to sit and complain, for he found him the most hateful among all the gods who lived on Olympus. Ares, he said, loved nothing more than war and endless strife, always stirring up battles and seeking conflict wherever he went. Zeus knew that the suffering Ares now felt was not without cause, and likely born from Hera's relentless anger, which never eased and always pushed toward more destruction. Zeus admitted that despite his power, even he was worn down by her constant words and pressure, and that it was likely because of her that Ares had ended up wounded. Still, Zeus said he would not leave Ares in pain for long, for Ares was still his son, born of the gods, and he could not simply let him suffer, though he confessed that if Ares had been born of any other parent and caused so much trouble, he would have long ago cast him down, far from the bright sky where the gods dwell. Then Zeus called upon the healer Paeon, the divine physician who knew the secrets of pain and the remedies that soothed it. Paeon came and scattered healing medicines across the wound, and as quickly as the juice of a fig thickens white milk, turning it from liquid to solid with just a stir, in just that speed did he heal the war god's injury. The pain vanished, the wound closed, and Ares, though shaken, felt his strength return. Hebe, the young goddess of youth, came to him then and washed the dirt and blood from his body, cleansing away the signs of his fall, and dressed him in fine robes once more. With his wounds gone and his body restored, Ares sat again beside Zeus, proud of his strength and gleaming again with the power of the gods. But down below, on the battlefield where the cries of men still echoed, the work of violence was far from finished. Hera and Athena, having brought an end to Ares' bloody rampage, returned to the house of Zeus, their mission done for the moment, leaving the field quiet for a time. The war was far from over. Ares, though healed, would soon feel a new wound, not to his body, but to his heart. For Zeus, in a plan to honor a promise to Thetis, the mother of the great warrior who had withdrawn from the battle, had agreed to give glory to the Trojans for a time, until her son's anger had cooled. So the gods were called back from the battlefield and ordered not to interfere while this plan unfolded. They sat apart, high on Olympus, watching but not acting, held back by Zeus's command, each of them resting their power, waiting. And during this time, a terrible blow fell upon Ares. In the heat of the clash between the Greeks and the Trojans, his own son, Ascalaphus, strong and brave, was struck down. A spear thrown by a Trojan prince found its mark in Ascalaphus' shoulder, driving deep, and the warrior fell to the ground. Dust rose around him as he collapsed, and his fingers clawed the earth in his final moments, trying to hold on, but his strength was gone. His death was quiet compared to the storm that had followed his father, but it was no less painful. Yet Ares, the god of war himself, did not know. He sat far away under the golden clouds at the edge of the world, where Zeus had ordered all the gods to stay, forbidden from entering the battle. He remained still, unaware that his son had fallen, that the life he had brought into the world had been taken by the very war he loved so dearly. And when the truth would reach him, the fury that rose in him would be even greater than before, not for pride, but for grief. The god who had roared with pain from a mortal wound would soon ache in silence from a father's sorrow. And though the sky was calm and the halls of Olympus gleamed in peace, below the earth was soaked in blood, and the loss of Ascalaphus was one more shadow cast over a war that had already swallowed so many. The gods waited still and silent, bound by Zeus's word, as the mortal world turned red with battle. Before all the gods who sat on Olympus in their high and shining home, there came a voice filled with grief and trouble, speaking with sharpness and sadness, for it seemed that a great sorrow had just come upon the god of war. A voice cried out that a terrible thing had happened to Ares, that sorrow had struck him, for his son, the warrior Ascalaphus, had fallen in battle. He who was dearest to Ares, the one the god of war claimed as his own flesh and blood, had been cut down in the fighting among mortals. As these words rang out, Ares could no longer sit still or keep his grief inside. With both hands he struck the thick muscles of his thighs, a loud and heavy sound that echoed through the halls of the gods, and in anger and deep sorrow he cried out with a voice that carried fury. He spoke of his pain and swore that he would no longer remain on Olympus while his son's body lay in the dust, slain by another's hand. He said that even if it meant facing death himself, if Zeus should strike him down with his thunderbolt and leave him lying among the corpses, soaked in blood and dust, he would still go. He would descend to the ships of the Greeks and avenge his son's death, for the bond between father and child was stronger than fear of punishment, even punishment from the king of all the gods. With that vow, Ares gave a fierce order to his companions, Fear and Terror, who were always near him and never far from war. He commanded them to ready his chariot, to yoke his horses, and prepare for war. Then he himself began to put on his shining armor, his bronze glittering as he moved with rage. The gods on Olympus watched as the storm of his grief turned toward action, and it seemed that another terrible clash might be coming, one that would bring pain not only to mortals, but to the gods themselves. It was a moment full of danger, for Ares, if he went through with his plan, might awaken the wrath of Zeus, and no one on Olympus could escape the anger of the Father of gods and men once it was stirred. Just as the storm was about to break, Athena, seeing the danger that could spread to all immortals, leapt up. She left her place, her calm gone, and with speed and strength moved to stop him. She did not pause or hesitate. In her fear for what might come to pass, she rushed through the halls and found Ares. She stepped in front of him, and before he could move, she stripped the helmet from his head, unfastened the great shield from his shoulders, and snatched the bronze spear from his heavy grip. She set these weapons aside, removing his power in that moment. Then she spoke to him with clear and forceful words. She told him he was mad, that his grief had turned his heart and mind away from wisdom. She reminded him of the truth, that though he still had ears to hear, his reason had left him. He no longer listened to the guidance of others, not even those who came bearing news directly from Zeus. She asked if he had not heard the words of Hera, the goddess who had just returned from Olympus with news from the king of the gods himself. She asked him if he truly wished to bring more suffering upon the gods, to return to Olympus not in glory, but in shame, dragged back by force and bringing with him sorrow that would touch even the blameless. For if Ares went against Zeus, the ruler would come down not only upon the guilty, but upon all who stood in his path, striking without mercy. Athena reminded him that this would not be the first warrior to fall, nor the last. Many brave men had already died, and many more would follow. Ascalaphus was strong, yes, but others were stronger still, and even they too could be slain. It was not the fate of gods to save every mortal born of their blood, for mortals must face death. It was a hard truth, but one Ares had to hear. She asked him as a fellow god to let go of his rage for the good of all. Her voice, though stern, reached him, and with the heat of his fury cooling, Ares gave up the fight. He sat down once more, no longer armored for war, seated now in silence, heavy with sorrow, but no longer driven by it. And so the threat passed. For now. Later the gods were no longer held back. After the death of Patroclus, who had been beloved by the greatest Greek warrior, the winds of war shifted again. The one who had withdrawn from the battle now returned, and with his return, Zeus allowed the gods to go down once more to Troy. With that, the heavens stirred again. The gods divided once more, each choosing sides, and the field of battle was no longer ruled only by mortals. Divine forces re-entered the war, and with their return came power and destruction not seen since the earliest days. In the chaos that followed, the gods clashed just as fiercely as the men below. Athena, fierce and untiring, faced those who stood against her. Among them was Ares, the god of war, who had once again entered the field. And in the heart of battle, as the lines between gods and men blurred, Athena struck down both Aphrodite and Ares. It was not just a battle of strength, but of will, and Athena, whose mind never wavered, overcame them both. Ares, who once roared across the field and filled the sky with cries of pain, was now felled by the very goddess who had stood against him before, the one who saw beyond the rage of war and moved with precision and purpose. And so, once again, the god of war was brought low, not by a mortal, but by a fellow immortal who did not fear his noise or his fury, but faced him with clarity and strength, proving that even gods must bow to wisdom. Incessant battle swept through the land, and at the command of the high ruler, the gods went down from Olympus to take part once more in the fighting among men, bringing their divine might into a war already heavy with pain and death. Among them came Ares, shining with the gleam of his helm, a god made for war and clothed in its fury. He took his place beside the Trojans, his chosen side in this terrible struggle, and with him came the radiant Apollo, his long, uncut hair flowing behind him like golden fire, his bow ready to strike. Artemis, the huntress, daughter of Leto, followed in silence, her arrows swift and deadly, her presence cold and sure. Aphrodite, too, was there, her smile gentle, but her will firm, ready to protect those she loved. Leto, their mother, stood calm and tall, while the river god Xanthos flowed near, his waters rising in silent support. On the battlefield, as the gods mingled with men, a greater force stirred, one that moved without shape but filled the hearts of all. Eris, hatred born of conflict, a defender of peoples, yet one who fed the fire of war. And beside her Athena bellowed, her cry louder than any trumpet, rising over the battlefield to challenge her foes and push her champions forward. On the other side, Ares, who always loved the noise of clashing spears and the wild dance of blood and war, bellowed too, not with fear, but with hunger for the fight. He loomed like a storm cloud, thick and black, first shouting orders from the peak of the Trojan citadel, then running like a shadow beside the sweet, swift river Simois, urging the warriors on with the madness of his voice. The gods had taken their places, and now, stirred by old grudges in the will of Zeus, they moved not just as spectators, but as forces of the battle itself. They pushed the men forward, guiding swords and shields, driving the Trojans and the Greeks to face each other again in a war that had already burned for so long. The sound of the gods' own anger soon rose above the cries of men, and their conflict broke out in the open, not hidden anymore. A great crash echoed across the sky and earth as the gods collided, divine power meeting divine power, and the world itself seemed to tremble. Thunder rolled through the clouds, not from the storm, but from the clash of immortals. Poseidon stood firm on one side, his trident steady, while across from him Apollo readied his feathered arrows, calm and dangerous. And Athena, wise and bold, took her place against Ares, the one she had fought before and would face again. Poseidon, speaking with clear foresight, had urged Hera to wait, to watch first from a distance and let the mortals fight unless Ares or Apollo stepped in to stop Achilles, for that would not be allowed. And so, on the slopes of the land and on the peaks near the rivers, the gods took their seats, each side watching the other, gathering their strength and thoughts, both hesitant to begin the first strike. A dark cloud gathered behind Poseidon and his allies, wrapping around them like a cloak, a veil of storm and readiness. On the other side, Apollo sat with Ares, who burned with rage, both watching, both ready, waiting for the signal. The air hung heavy, silent for a heartbeat, but above them all, Zeus sat far above, high in the sky on Olympus, and though he knew the weight of the war, he found some strange pleasure in watching the gathering fury, a twisted joy in the battle of gods. Then the silence broke. Hatred, old and deep, fell like a heavy curtain, and the fury that had been held back was unleashed. A crash like no other rang out as the gods rushed into each other, and the world echoed with their wrath. Earth groaned beneath their feet, and the sky cried out like trumpets. Zeus, watching, laughed in the deep quiet of his heart, entertained by the struggle of those who shared his blood. Ares was the first to move. The god of war could never wait, and he rose with his bronze spear in hand, ready to strike. He moved toward Athena, full of scorn and fire, his voice sharp and bitter as he shouted at her, accusing her once more of betrayal. He remembered how she had urged Diomedes to wound him, how she had guided the spear that pierced his divine body, how she had pushed the mortal to challenge him. And now here she was again, standing against him, unafraid, daring once more to face the god of war himself. The memory of that pain burned in him, not just the wound, but the shame of it, and he lifted his weapon high, ready to meet her in full fury. Athena, standing still, did not back away, for her strength was not only in her arms, but in her calm, clear mind. Around them, gods clashed, their powers lighting the sky and shaking the mountains. What had once been a war among men had now grown into a war of the divine, and none could say what would come next as the heavens roared and the earth trembled under the weight of the gods' unending rage. Laying hold of the far-seen pike, Ares, full of rage and wounded pride, thrust it straight and hard into the shield that was no ordinary shield, but the terrible aegis, covered in fluttering straps and horror, a shield that even the thunderbolt of Zeus himself could not break. The weapon that had pierced so many bodies of mortal men struck against it, but it did not pierce, for the aegis held strong. Ares, god of war and blood, had been bested in the field once already, and now sought to repay the pain dealt to him. But as he struck, his fury unmatched, Athena was already prepared. She did not falter or hesitate. Her sharp eyes caught sight of a stone that lay there in the plain, a stone black as night, rough and jagged, massive in weight, one that men of long ago had placed as a boundary in the open land. With the strength of a goddess and the precision of one born for battle, she lifted that stone high into the air and hurled it. It flew across the space with a sound like thunder and struck Ares full in the neck. The impact was terrible. The god of war staggered, his limbs undone, and he crashed to the ground with a roar of pain that echoed through the valley. He fell wide, covering 7 full acres with the sprawl of his giant form, and his hair tangled in the dust of the earth, while the iron of his armor clanged against itself and the stones beneath him. Over him stood Athena, unmoved and calm, and she laughed. The laughter was not cruel, but firm, the laughter of one who has proven strength through action. She looked down upon him with the brightness of her eyes, glowing not just with light, but with the force of wisdom and power. And though her words were sharp, they came from a place of justice. She reminded Ares that even now he had failed to understand the difference in power between them, that when he fought blindly and angrily, she would always be stronger. She reminded him, too, that this pain was his punishment, not just from her, but from his own mother, who was filled with anger because he had turned his back on those he once promised to help, the Greeks who were being cut down, while he stood beside the Trojans. Her voice rang out with truth, and then, without waiting for reply, she turned and looked away, her gaze no longer fixed on the one who had fallen. But from the side came Aphrodite, daughter of Zeus, goddess of beauty, but also of loyalty, and she took Ares gently by the hand. She helped him rise, though his strength had not yet returned fully, and he groaned with each step, each breath. His pride was wounded more than his body, and he leaned on her as they moved away from the place where he had fallen. Yet even this quiet retreat did not go unnoticed, for Hera, with her white arms bright against the clouds, saw them as they moved. Her voice called out at once to Athena, her words sharp and mocking. She pointed to Aphrodite, who once again sought to pull Ares from the field and shield him from the pain and shame of defeat. Hera would not allow this, and neither would Athena, who rushed forward once more, her heart quick with joy at the chance to strike again. She reached them swiftly, not with a weapon this time, but with the full force of her divine hand, and she struck Aphrodite in the chest. The blow was heavy and sudden, and it sent the goddess of love sprawling to the earth. Her knees buckled, her heart trembled, and she collapsed beside Ares. Now both lay flat upon the generous ground, the place where mortals bled, and now gods too found themselves defeated. Athena stood over them again, and her words rose like thunder across the battlefield. She did not boast idly, but spoke with the full force of her cause, saying that if all those who aided the Trojans were to fall, as these two had, then the war would have long ago ended. If only they had all faced her and fallen in like fashion, then the city of Troy would have been taken, its walls broken, its defenders scattered. Then peace might have come, and the Greeks might have returned home. As she finished, Hera stood beside her, smiling with approval, a silent sign that the gods who stood with the Greeks still held their strength and will. Yet even as this moment passed, grief still remained. Ares, who had been struck down in the dust, soon felt another pain greater than the last. For after the death of the mighty Hector, champion of Troy, a new warrior came to fight for the city. She was strong and proud, an Amazon queen, a daughter of Ares himself. Her name was Penthesilea, and she came not only to defend Troy, but to honor her father through her bravery. But though her courage was mighty, she too was slain by the hand of Achilles, swift-footed and deadly. Ares, god of war, felt the sorrow of her death more deeply than any wound. Athena had given him, for this was not a battle between immortals, but the loss of his own child in the world of men. His pain was vast, but it did not stop him. The war still burned, and it was not long before another Greek hero came to the field, the son of Achilles, young Neoptolemus. After the death of his father, he stepped into the battle, fierce and eager to prove himself. And once again Ares rallied the Trojans, lifting their spirits and pushing them forward, determined that the war not be lost, that Troy would not fall while he had strength to fight. But nothing could hold back the fate already set. The gods would clash again, and the dust of battle would rise once more, carrying with it the cries of gods and men, the sound of bronze against bone, and the endless echo of war. Leading warrior of the Greeks, and with the fire of his father burning in his blood, the son of Achilles pressed hard upon the Trojans, scattering them like dry leaves before a storm. His sword was swift, his spear unerring, and the battlefield rang with the clash of armor and the cries of the dying. The Trojans, seeing his fury and the force with which he cut down their strongest men, turned and fled, rushing back toward the gates of their city in fear. They had seen heroes fall before, but this new warrior, born of Achilles' might, seemed like doom itself unleashed. But just as they faltered, just as their hope seemed lost, the god of war himself stirred. From the high halls of heaven, Ares came, unseen by the rest of the gods, moving swift and silent as the wind, his heart burning with purpose. He was not sent by Zeus, nor summoned by any prayer, but came of his own fierce will, drawn by the cries of battle and the scent of blood. His great chariot thundered over the sky, and when his feet touched the ground, the earth groaned under the weight of his steps. None saw him, for he was hidden by a thick mist that wrapped around him like a cloak, but all heard the sound he made when he hurled his heavy spear into the center of the battle. That sound was not the voice of a man, but a god, deep and vast, echoing like thunder through the plain. The Trojans, who only a moment before had been driven back in fear, now stood frozen, their hearts pounding. They had not seen Ares, but they felt his presence, and they heard his cry, and it stirred something deep inside them. Among them was Helenus, the seer, the prophet whose soul was wise and open to the voice of gods. He alone knew what had come. He knew that the cry was not mortal, that it was the call of Ares himself, and he shouted to the men, telling them not to fear, not to run. The one they fled from, the son of Achilles, was a man, mighty though he was, but still a man. He could bleed, he could fall, but now on their side stood one who could not die, one who was the very soul of war, one whose strength no mortal could match. That voice, that great and rolling sound, was the voice of Ares, who had come to help them in their darkest hour. The Trojans, hearing the words of their prophet, felt their courage return. Their hands tightened around their weapons, their backs straightened. No longer did they flee. They turned, faces set, hearts steady. And as one, they surged forward again into battle. Men who had moments before tasted fear now fought with new strength, driven by the unseen god who marched among them. Sword met sword, spear shattered shield. The sound of battle rose again, fierce and terrible. Death came swiftly, carried by the hands of both Greek and Trojan. Ares, who drank blood like wine, was filled with joy, and so too was the goddess of battle strife, who walked among them, her hands and shoulders splashed with crimson. She helped no side, for she was sister to war itself, and she cared only for the chaos, the clash, the wildness of the fight. Sweat poured from her limbs as she moved through the battlefield, smiling as men fell around her. The goddesses of fate watched and were pleased. Doom itself stood close by, its eyes wide with glee. The goddess of strife laughed loud and long, and her laughter was answered by the great shout of Ares, whose voice shook the very ranks of the Greeks, filling them with terror, and lifted the spirits of the Trojans, making their hearts bold. But in the heart of the storm stood the son of Echidnades. He alone among the Greeks did not tremble. He stood unmoved, steady as stone, his arm unwearied, his blade red with the blood of enemies. He did not care that Ares walked with the Trojans. He did not flinch when he felt the divine hand at work. He fought on, striking down all who came before him, and each time he slew he shouted in joy, his heart burning with the pride of his father's name. He had no fear, not of gods, not of men. Again and again he pushed forward, and still the battle raged around him, filled with the clash of weapons and the roar of dying men. No pause came, no rest. It was a storm without end. The earth soaked in blood, and the air was filled with dust and screams. Still Ares walked, his spear flashing, his shadow deepening the chaos. Still the Trojans pushed, and still the Greeks gave ground. Yet even in the madness, the balance of war held even, neither side breaking. It was a day of endless struggle, where gods and mortals bled together, where fear and rage rose like smoke from the field. And above it all echoed the laughter of strife and the shout of war, and the silence of fate, waiting for the scales to tip. The fierce clash of mortal warriors was but a shadow of the greater battle unfolding among the gods themselves, as the war on earth echoed in the heavens with equal ferocity. The son of Echidnades pressed forward against the Trojans with unyielding courage, his spirit like a mountain standing firm against the howling winds of a raging storm. No matter the fury unleashed upon him, he remained unshaken, a steadfast force in the midst of chaos. Watching this mortal's bravery, the god of war, Ares, grew angry and restless, his wrath burning hotter with each passing moment. He wished to cast aside the veil of mist that concealed him and confront the young warrior face to face, to test his strength and fury in battle. But before the fight could begin, the goddess Athena, descending swiftly from the heights of Olympus to the forest-covered slopes of Ida, intervened. The earth trembled beneath her steps. The streams of Xanthos whispered uneasily at her passing, and the very souls of the nymphs who lived in the hills were filled with dread for the city of Priam. Her immortal armor gleamed with flashes of lightning, and from her shield came the breath of fire, like serpents coiling in deadly warning. The great crest of her helmet swept through the clouds as she prepared to strike against the war god himself. Yet, despite their great power and fierce wills, neither dared to challenge the will of Zeus, who sat thundering above all from high heaven. His terrible anger held them both back. Ares, sensing the danger, withdrew from the battle, knowing well the consequences of defying the king of gods. His proud heart, once filled with rage for the Trojans, now turned cold as he passed from the plain of Troy to the cold lands of Thrace, his anger and desire for battle subdued for the moment. Athena, too, vanished from the plain, returning to her sacred city of Athens, leaving the mortal armies to fight on their own. The Trojans' strength began to wane, their spirits flagging as the relentless Greeks pressed forward, eager to break through and claim victory. But even as their courage faltered, the god of war was not done with the fight. In the final desperate battles around the gates of Troy, the great defender Aeneas surged forward to drive back the Greeks, who sought to force their way inside. Ares stood at his side, cloaked in darkness, a terrible and invisible presence lending power to every strike. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their feet as the mighty god's strength infused the Trojan warrior, making his limbs flash like lightning sent from the heavens. The Greeks faltered, their lines breaking as the unyielding might of the god-backed defense crushed their assault. No man dared to meet the divine eyes that watched from the shadows, and the shield wall they had so carefully formed shattered like brittle clay beneath the storm of blows from Aeneas and his terrible companion. But fate's wheel was turning still, and the Greeks, clever and cunning, devised a final desperate plan to end the war once and for all: the construction of the great wooden horse, a deceitful gift meant to bring the fall of Troy. As the Greeks labored in secret, the gods too grew restless, divided in their loyalties and passions. With Zeus withdrawn to the distant streams of ocean and the secret caverns of Tethys, far from the troubles of mortals and immortals alike, the gods themselves erupted in fierce conflict. Hearts turned against each other, ancient friendships shattered by the lust for war and the desire to influence the outcome of the mortal struggle below. They soared through the skies on fierce winds, crashing down by the murmuring banks of the river Xanthos, where they gathered in battle lines, gods aligned with the Greeks, standing opposed to those who favored the Trojans. Each was consumed with the desire to fight, to prove their power and sway the course of history. Among them stood Athena, who took up arms once more, confronting Ares in a battle that shook the heavens and earth alike. Their fight was wild and terrible, lightning flashing, thunder roaring as they clashed, each unwilling to yield. Yet even this fierce divine combat was not allowed to continue. Zeus, hearing the tumult and seeing the danger to all, commanded the gods to withdraw from the war, to cease their quarrels and leave mortals to their fate. The city of Troy was doomed to fall, and no god could change what had been set in motion. Thus the great war came to its tragic conclusion, with gods and men alike swept up in the tides of fate, their wills entwined in a fierce and endless struggle marked by glory and sorrow, courage and despair. Through all this, the mighty god of war stood as both destroyer and protector, his fierce presence shaping the course of battle and the destiny of heroes, a reminder that even immortals are bound by the will of higher powers and the unchanging laws of fate. The wide sea stretched endlessly beneath the sky, calm on its surface but stirred by the wrath of the gods above, whose anger had reached a boiling point. These mighty immortals, furious and full of hate, were eager to destroy the cunning wooden horse, and with it the hopes of Troy, along with all the ships that had brought the Greeks to this bitter war and the fair city of Ilion itself. Yet despite their fierce desire to bring ruin to the enemy, the force that governs all things, the all-contriving fate, held them back from such destruction. Fate, mysterious and unyielding, kept their hands from striking and turned their hearts against one another, sowing discord among them even as they prepared to act. It was the war god who rose first to the battle, full of rage and ready to fight, and he charged at the goddess Athena with furious intent. The two gods collided like unstoppable forces, their golden arms clashing with a sound like thunder rolling through the heavens. Around them, the sea itself roared, waves crashing in violent echoes of their conflict, while the dark earth beneath their immortal feet shook and quaked from the power of their footsteps. Their cries of battle rang far and wide, echoing through the vast sky and plunging even into the deepest shadows of Hades' realm. The ancient Titans, those primeval beings who dwelled in the gloom below, trembled at the sound, shaken by the might of the gods' fury. The long ridges of Ida sighed under the weight of their struggle, while the rivers that flowed from those hills wept clamorous streams, and the ravines groaned in pain as the land itself seemed to mourn the turmoil. Far away, the Argive ships that carried the Greek warriors and the mighty towers of Priam's city stood silently, unaware of the divine battle raging just beyond their sight, shielded by the decree of heaven, so that mortal men feared not, knowing nothing of the conflict that would shape their fate. As the battle raged, The gods' mighty hands wrenched great peaks from the crest of Ida itself, hurling them against one another with the force of mountains clashing. Yet these enormous rocks shattered like brittle sand, crumbling into dust before the invincible limbs of the battling deities. High above it all, at the very edge of the earth, the mind of Zeus took notice of the chaos unfolding. Leaving behind the cool streams of ocean and the distant caverns of Tethys, he ascended swiftly to the heights of the wide heavens. His chariot was pulled by the four winds, the east, north, west, and south, each taking the form of mighty horses. Leading this stormy team was Iris, the rainbow-plumed messenger, guiding the chariot with the steady pull of her eternal ear. Time himself had crafted this chariot of adamant, with hands that never wearied, forging it to carry Zeus across the sky. As Zeus reached the giant ridge of Olympus, his anger shook the very foundation of the firmament. From east to west, his thunder crashed like the roar of 1,000 storms, and lightning flashed in fierce torrents, striking the earth again and again with blinding speed. The endless sky blazed with fire as the god poured out his wrath, and terror fell upon the hearts of the immortals below. Though they were deathless, even they trembled before the might of their king's fury. Amidst this fearful scene, Themis, the goddess of order and justice, moved swiftly through the clouds, her form trembling with concern for her fellow gods. She had no part in the strife and stood calmly between the fighters, seeking to bring peace to the chaos. With a voice that carried the weight of reason and warning, she cried out to the gods to forbear the conflict, to cease their fighting. She reminded them that when Zeus is angry, it is no place for everlasting gods to battle each other for the sake of mortal men, creatures so brief and fragile. If they continued, destruction would surely come upon them all. Zeus would tear up the hills themselves and hurl ruin upon the immortals, sparing neither sons nor daughters, burying them all beneath a single heap of shattered earth. There would be no escape from this darkness, no return to the light, only an eternal prison of horror. Hearing the terrible threat of Zeus, the gods were filled with dread and gave heed to Themis's words. Their wrath was cast aside, and peace and friendship were restored among them. Some of the gods soared heavenward, returning to the lofty realms above, while others plunged into the depths of the sea, seeking refuge in its vastness. Still, some remained upon the earth, settling quietly and waiting for the war to reach its fated end. Thus the furious battle of gods was stilled, the great quarrel ended by the voice of reason and the will of the supreme ruler. The mighty forces that had threatened to tear the world apart were drawn back, their anger tempered by the knowledge of the terrible price that must be paid if the heavens were to fall into chaos. And so the wide sea, the distant mountains, and the trembling earth were left to witness the unfolding fate of mortal men, while the gods, for a time, held their power in check, waiting for the final moments of the great war to play out beneath the watching sky.